Hello everybody, I'm back with another video for you today, and before you dislike this video, I'm not here to hate on Gwent. Quite the opposite, I love the game and the design and, spot it's in right now in terms of the gameplay. I wanted to talk about some of the things that have happened after Homecoming in particular with Gwent, and talk about the viewership on Twitch, the player base, etc., as well as what the game can do in the future to improve upon that stuff and gain momentum that it's maybe lost at some point. And I also want to give a few, light criticisms, suggestions, as I often do in these kinds of videos, for the game to improve, that I think will help. So, first things first, we have this Reddit post here that you can see that was made about a week ago by ZenPaiGG, and effectively is discussing the viewer numbers on Twitch for the game, and the short answer, I should say, of it is the viewership has declined by about 50%. Over the last 12 months, particularly after Homecoming happened, was when, the majority of the viewership, decreased. So, I want to talk about why I think this is. I think it's pretty obvious, the reasons, behind that decrease, and presumably the decrease in viewership. I'm going to assume that also means a decrease in player base. They're usually quite correlated, quite heavily correlated, although not always, but that's the kind of what I'm going to go with as an underlying thought here. So, the main reason for this drop in viewership, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. A whole new game just got released effectively, right? Everything changed with Homecoming. A lot of people, including even myself, felt like it was a really large amount of stuff to relearn, because it was effectively a whole new game, right? And that maybe even left some people feeling like a little bit betrayed, like, oh, my favourite game is gone. What do I have to do now? I have to learn a new game. I don't want to do that, etc., right? So, kind of a little bit of feelings of betrayal, or just simply having to relearn a whole new game, probably put a lot of Gwent's core audience off, especially in the first, amount of the first bit of time after Homecoming. I think especially also the gameplay problems that Homecoming had, things like, Mulligan not being very well implemented, and, maybe balance issues and whatnot as well. Stuff like that. The game feeling a bit unintuitive probably put a few people off, but I think it's worth saying I don't think the quality of the game, and other people have made this point in this Reddit thread, I don't think the quality of the game really correlates that much with the popularity. I think that momentum that was lost as a result of Homecoming, as a result of even Homecoming being announced before that, is more to do with people feeling like they'd have to relearn something, not therefore being committed to the game and choosing to play other things or whatever. So that's obviously a big factor. Also, it didn't help that pretty much all of the big streamers for the game, bar a few, were not even playing Gwent after Homecoming. We're not streaming it, a long time after Homecoming, a week or two after it had arrived. They maybe tried it out, people like Live Coach, Merchant, Mogwai, etc., Super JJ. These guys, maybe tried it, so they didn't like it, whatever. Point is, they bring in a lot of viewers on Twitch, and I'm sure that also had an effect on the viewer numbers. So, those guys not streaming anymore, the game. And, also, I want to talk about the esports scene, because that's something that's died down a lot since Homecoming, and those tournaments tend to bring in a lot of viewer numbers as well, right? You've got maybe 10,000 people plus watching tournaments, so obviously if you're not having tournaments, the numbers are going to be quite down. And I think this period after Homecoming, up till now, has been the period with the least Gwent tournaments since the Masters series started. I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure it's actually at least been the joint least with maybe the Homecoming drought period, but I think there were even more tournaments going on then than there are now. So this real, lack of tournaments, lack of esports going on in Gwent has also contributed to a lack of viewer numbers. Whether or not that correlates to a lack of player base, that's maybe a little bit questionable, but I think it definitely had an effect there. So yeah, back in the day we had tournaments going on every other week pretty much, with all the big names competing. Nowadays, not really going on. We haven't had one for ages. Challenger and World Masters will be coming up. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So yeah, pretty much, I think these are the main issues why, or main reasons rather, why the game has actually dropped in viewership and maybe even player base. obviously now let's talk about the ways that the game can regain some of the momentum that it lost. You know, it used to be the case that we had Hearthstone players switching over, tournaments every other week, lots of viewers, people consistently joining the game and whatnot. Nowadays it's a little bit, it's more chilled, I think, and the evidence here suggests that not as many people watching, not as many people playing. So what is going to happen in the future that will maybe, you know, help in that regard? So what do we have? Firstly, of course, tournaments will be coming back at some point. Challenger World Masters are going to be a thing in the future. World Masters will even see the return of Life Coach, which will undoubtedly bring in some amount of viewers, some amount of players to the game. Questionable how much that will actually, you know, impact, but if Life Coach does play, he does have a spot for World Masters. That will have an effect, of course. And yeah, really just two big tournaments where CDPR can showcase their really amazing, you know, tournament organization and creativity and whatnot with the event location, with the stuff that goes on during the tournament. Of course, those will help to bring in viewers and probably players for the game as well. That's probably the least of the sort of tricks up their sleeve that CDPR has, I suppose, to regain momentum for Gwent. But it's worth noting that these will definitely help, and you know, even another year of esports, another series of the Masters series would definitely help as well to incentivize people to actually play the game. Right now, I don't even feel like there's much point in playing other, of course, than for enjoyment, but really, competition-wise, there's not much going on. There's not even a promise of future, you know, opens and challenges coming after World Masters. Presumably there probably will be, but we don't know that for sure, and that is obviously going to put people off playing if they want to be competitive in a card game, or like truly at the top level. So that's important. Next thing is expansions. Of course, the game will be having expansions in the future, and it's worth noting that in this post they do mention that Crimson Curse had a very positive effect on the game. It didn't quite maybe bring up the game to the level that it used to be, but it definitely did boost the viewer numbers, the player base and whatnot. I think it's more of a short-term thing. I don't think the players were, you know, are still playing at this point. I mean, if we look on Reddit, there's even only 300 people on Reddit right now, you know, when the game is really quite, you know, popping off, as it were. During those kind of expansion time, it's maybe 1,000 people on Reddit at a time I've seen, so a little bit of an inference there you can make, but really, expansions are a big short-term boost to the game. Of course, it makes a lot of sense. People want to come back, they want to try new cards, they want to try new things, strategies, etc. What's really important is that with these expansions, the game has a way to retain the players that it regains, or gains, you know, new, old players alike. You have to make sure the game is enjoyable, of course, and has all the systems in place that would incentivize somebody to, you know, carry on playing after they've tried out the expansion and have maybe got a bit bored of it after a couple of weeks or whatever. So we'll talk about ways that they can improve that in a second. That's, of course, to do with the gameplay rather than any of these grander or more, yeah, holistic ideas or whatever. So expansions coming up. We do have the a new faction going to be coming in the new expansion, supposedly. So that will bring in a lot of players, I imagine, wanting to try out a new faction. I'm definitely very excited for that if it is coming. I hope it will be quite soon, but who knows, it might be a month, 2 months away, whatever. But of course, these will have an effect on the momentum of the game. But really, it's going to be down to the actual game itself to then retain players. And I think this isn't even the biggest thing that will help the game pushing forward. I think the biggest factor that will help the game to regain momentum is actually the mobile release that will happen this year. And of course, this is going to bring in a lot of players because game on mobile, it's a card game. Mobile card games are very popular. Things like Hearthstone are getting most of its player base from mobile, right? So I imagine this will have a pretty large impact. I can't say how much. I would imagine it would be bringing back Gwent to the level in terms of viewership and player base of pre-Homecoming, of open beta, closed beta. I would imagine will be at least to those levels after the mobile release happens. I think it will be a really big boost. But beyond that, who knows? But, you know, if we're getting a lot more people interested in Twitch, playing the game, etc., if you then throw in expansions, tournaments as well, then I think that it's very feasible that with the mobile release sort of being a catalyst for more growth for the game and more momentum for the game, I think it's very easy to imagine that the game could gain some traction, gain some steam in the same way that it used to have, if that popularity is surging, and good expansions, good tournaments happening as well, then I don't see why that wouldn't be the case. So that's pretty much all the ways that the game can, you know, flip this bit of a low period Crimson Curse was a step in the right direction for sure, and I think that was evident to me that the game has the potential to, regain its popularity for sure. A lot of people want to play the game, they just are maybe waiting for new content, they maybe get bored after a few weeks of playing, which even I do, to be honest. You get burnt out if you play a lot of a card game, or any game really. That's just natural. So we need more content, and I think tournaments would help as well, and of course mobile release. So what about the gameplay itself? I want to give a few kind of thoughts on, how the game can still be improved in terms of mechanics, as well as UI and, well, not necessarily UI, but, game systems, I guess you can call them. So this is really important for retaining players, of course. Now, I think the first thing is game speed has been improved upon, definitely, with things like auto pass being a thing that were added, animation speed for leader abilities and whatnot speeding up, but I think there's still room for improvement here, and I think this is such an important thing. When you've got players returning who used to play Gwent in particular, they're going to look at new Gwent and be like, it's not quite as responsive, it doesn't feel like as snappy and fast as old Gwent did. I think that's a real turn off for players, so any movement that you can get closer and closer to that old fluidity and, speed that the previous iteration of the game had would be ideal. And I think the easiest way to do this is maybe, well, not easy, but the best way to do this is by being able to queue up order effects. Order effects are kind of having a bit of a problem in terms of that fluidity, because you have to click something, then click another thing. In old Gwent, it would be just click, boom, the thing comes down, you do the thing, blah, blah, blah. Like, no order effects were going on, so the game was faster overall. Definitely being able to queue up animations, queue up order, leader effects, etc., and have them fire off, even if your turn ends or whatever. I think that would help a lot. Right now, if you rope, you can't do stuff because you have to wait for the animation to finish before doing another thing, which makes it feel really clunky and slow, I think. So that's definitely something that could be improved upon still. Other than that, just again, faster animations, more kind of, snappiness. I think we really need that in the game, especially for old players who maybe are coming back to try out an expansion. If that's not something that's there, they're going to feel like the game isn't fast and fluid and doesn't feel good. So that's still a very important thing to be improving upon. I think CDPR will be doing that for sure. That's definitely something they've had on their radar for a while. And also, of course, the new player experience is very important, because if you've got new players coming in, or even old players, you want to make sure that they've got all the proper tools and, tutorials and starter decks and whatnot to really prosper in the game and not feel like they're, having a hard time making good decks or not really understanding the mechanics or whatever. So that stuff's really important, new player experience. CDPR knows about this as well, and I do believe they will have new starter decks and whatnot coming out soon, but that is very key. If they aren't in place by the time the next expansion comes around, that's a real missed opportunity in my opinion, because a lot of players will not get the best experience they can from the game if the starter decks are weak and not representative of what the game can, allow for. Very important thing there, but I think that's going to be improved upon, which is really good to know. And finally, I've heard people talking about game balanced game design. I want to throw my kind of 2 cents in, I guess you could say. A lot of discussion around control versus removal in the game right now. Maybe not so much now, but I've seen quite a few Reddit threads in the past, and I want to talk about it a little bit. Now, generally my feeling is there are quite a lot of binary interactions in the game right now. You're thinking, in Gwent in general, it tends to be quite binary stuff. There's no sort of health or mana in other card games. A lot of the interactions are just, I have this card, do you have the answer to this card? Do you have a thing that can deal with this or not? And if you don't, this thing will get more value or whatever. That's not necessarily a bad interaction or a bad way to design the game. It's just it can lead to some maybe not so fun situations. So what are these binary things that I'm talking about? Well, we have artifacts and artifact removal, we have weather and weather removal, or, lack of weather removal, whatever. And we have engines and removal, whether that be locks, movement, damage, etc. So really, the point is, some cards, if you don't have the answer, they pose the question, do you have this type of thing? I play an artifact, do you have an artifact removal? I play an engine, do you have removal for the engine? If you don't have the answer to, that thing, then their card will get a lot of value. And I think in Homecoming Gwent, the value that it generates is a lot more than it used to be in Old Gwent, and that can lead to you know, certain interactions deciding the game. So, for example, NECA as a card, right? It's 2 point for 4 provision if it gets removed by something like, I don't know, Dolbathana Archer or whatever. Terrible card, 2 for 4, really bad. Really, really bad. Way worse than what you'd want for a 4 provision card, which maybe is 4, 5, 6 even points, right? So, 2 point for 4, really bad when it gets answered. If the opponent, though, doesn't have the answer for the NECAs, they can generate maybe 10 points, maybe 12, maybe a little bit less, but you see the point, they can get an insane amount of value. Like, at that point, they'd be better than any other card in your deck, effectively, in terms of provision and point cost. So the fact that these kind of cards exist can mean that some games are just purely decided on whether you drew your card that could answer it, maybe whether you even included a card that could answer it in your deck or not. And if you couldn't, then maybe you lose as a result of that, and if you could, then you win or whatever, right? And I think that leads to a lot of situations where the player feels a little bit powerless, in the sense that maybe their deck wasn't built in the right way to win the matchup, and that leads to binary matchups. And I think this also highlights the problem with removal in general, in terms of no unit decks being prevalent. No units are a kind of response to removal and the over-prevalence of that. You're able to then counter the removal, rendering their you know, removal cards very weak. Effectively, that's the answer to removal. Player plays lots of removal cards. The question they ask is, do you have stuff I can remove? And if you don't, then you're winning that interaction, and probably winning the game off of it. Now, this isn't necessarily an only bad thing, right? The other result of having these binary interactions that can be game deciding is a higher skill ceiling, actually, because if you're able to, you know, use your brain, play cleverly, and save the card you need to save for their particular card, you know, answer this with that, that can definitely distinguish a good player from a great player, or a bad player from a good player, or whatever, because obviously you're able to maybe win the game off of one smart decision, or a couple of smart decisions, or whatever. So definitely the skill ceiling, I think, is raised by having these, you know, one mistake can potentially really, really ruin your game, and really wreck you, or one card that you should have included in your deck or whatever can lose you the game or not, or whatever. But I think, personally, okay, first, I want to say what the devs would probably respond to the idea of NECA getting so much value or potentially being terrible. They'd probably say that the risk associated with playing that card, you know, it can be quite bad. That risk, therefore, allows it to, you know, potentially be very, very good. It's, like, you know, quite fair in that way. Personally, I want to give my thoughts on the whole removal and control and all this sort of stuff versus no units. And you know how I feel about no units decks. I don't think they're particularly fun, and they are incentivized by this kind of over-prevalence of control and removal in some sense. There are a lot of decks that do have a lot of removal, and I think that it's really hard to find the balance between removal and engine, of course, value. Now, I think, as I said, in Old Gwent, the value that cards could generate was not, the ceiling wasn't as high as it is now. So there's a couple of things. I think, firstly, the ceiling maybe should be lowered a little bit on engine cards and stuff, because they can generate just so much value. It means that you're really heavily incentivized to play removal. If you don't, then you're just going to get run over by something like a Henselt with all of its engines that just get like 10 points each or whatever for 4 provisions. You know what I mean? So firstly, reducing the ceiling on engine cards. You could also even reduce the floor on, or rather increase, reduce the floor on removal cards, I should say, and that would help to balance those two. But more importantly, I think there's a sweet spot that can be achieved with a mechanic like Armor. Armor was a mechanic that got removed, but that allows you to really effectively balance engines in a way that doesn't make them overpowered. Like, right now, if you balance an engine, it either has to be terrible because, okay, firstly, it has to be either easily removed or not easily removed. If it's easily removed, then it's going to be a bad engine, and if it's not easily removed, then it gets points on the board already, so therefore the engine effect can't be too powerful, otherwise it's very, very strong. And I mean, there are cards like that, like Trebuchet, for example, which are very strong because they get the points on the board and they can then be an engine worth loads of points every turn. So Armor allows you to have kind of weak engines that are weak at the start, but they gain their value slowly, which is what you want an engine card to do, but it allows you to protect that card and not have it be weak on the board, like something like a Trebuchet or a reinforced, you know, Trebuchet or Ballista or whatever. Things like maybe that Demovan would want to play. If those had Armor, then you can justify playing such a low point card on the board, because at least if it gets removed, it will generate some value through the Armor. I'm not sure why armor got removed. It was effectively the one way that the game had to really balance the idea of control versus engines, and I'm not even sure it was used to its full potential back in the day. So I would really love for them to re-implement it and do even more with armor than they used to, because I think just even putting armor on every single engine card, that might not feel thematically correct, right to do, but I think we have shield at the moment, but it doesn't really get the job done in the same way that armor, as a stat that just cards that generate long-term value, if they had that stat, you would then be able to balance them appropriately in terms of the immediate value they would generate, the value over time. You'd be able to cap that at a reasonable amount. They would still be quite strong potentially, but not too strong when the opponent doesn't have removal. That's really the idea. You want to make them so they're not horrible when the opponent has removal, but not overpowered when the opponent doesn't. It's a really hard balance to find. I don't know, I don't think I could even conceive of balancing everything so that it was all, quote-unquote perfect. It's a very hard thing to do, and that's something that I'm sure the devs will iterate upon as time goes on, and eventually it will get into a sweet spot, I suppose. Right now it feels a bit off, in my opinion, but that's just my take. Of course, I'm sure, some of you would disagree and think it's fine, but that's okay, we have different opinions. Anyway, effectively, those were some of my thoughts. A little bit of a criticism at the end there on things the game could and should improve upon, potentially, in my opinion, as well as reasons behind some of the viewership drops, and hopefully what can be done in the future to reverse that. But yeah, sorry for no gameplay recently. I've been, of course, feeling the burnout a little bit. I'll probably get back to that in a week or so. So stay tuned. I also have a new YouTube channel, which I'll link to below. If you want to go subscribe to that, feel free. It'll be for non-Gwent content if you're interested in that sort of stuff. Politics, philosophy, other games, who knows. I'm going to do everything and anything on there probably. I haven't got any videos on there yet, but stay tuned for that. And yeah, thanks a lot for watching, guys. Of course, subscribe if you'd like more videos as always, and I will see you next time.